Good evening, everyone. If those in the back could find a seat. I'm Elliot Gerson of the Aspen Institute. Delighted to welcome all of you here tonight. Very sorry that there's no parking between here and Basalt, it seems. And so congratulate all of you for finding your way here. This is the third Murdock Mind, Body, Spirit lecture this year, a series that we are extremely indebted to Jerry and Gina Murdock for. Thank you very, very much. And today we are honored to feature someone I have known for a long time, since he was actually a superstar in college, making an already profound difference, particularly around some of these same issues that have animated his career since then. He's passionate about bringing people together to recognize how much we share in spirituality and fundamental values, despite what might and what today often tragically does separate us by religion. The work he has done with young people has brought him national praise and a position on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council. He's written several books, wonderful books, including one that he will sign tonight that will be outside and that we'll talk about some this evening, Interfaith Leadership, a primer. The topic all about how to be a values-based leader, specifically in the context of cross-religion dialogue or dialogue between people of religion who have faith and people who might not have faith, is really a very Aspen-like concept. How should one lead in contexts like this? Eboo has a doctorate in sociology of religion from Oxford, which is actually the context in which we first met. And he is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Core, a proud Muslim, a great American, and a good friend. So, Eboo, thank you very much for being here. I thought before we actually talk about your book, we might talk a little bit about your sense of the state of interfaith relations in the country, if not the world today, in the sense of religious understanding and tolerance. And I think given some obvious signs that state, from my opinion, isn't very good, it just seems to me why this book is that more critical. First of all, in the United States and the state of religious prejudice. Despite it being a country with the First Amendment religious clauses, multiple religions, and having Americans of every religion in the world, and the fact that religious tolerance is in a sense part of our national creed, the situation right now is, at least from my perspective, not very good. For example, I read the other day that, hard to believe, but 47% of Americans think Muslims should wear a badge. And we know just from the presidential campaign that actually a majority of one of our great parties think that potentially all Muslims should at least temporarily not be allowed in the country. So what is your sense of where we stand today in the United States on this issue?
Sure. So first of all, just a couple of openings. Number one, a big thank you to you, Elliot, not only for doing this. Elliot is becoming a rare breed, and he's the moderator who actually reads the book beforehand. And it's not like he has nothing else to do at Aspen. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
It's a great book.
Yeah. And thank you for being an early believer in IFYC back in 2000, 2001. Any budding social entrepreneur or civic leader needs somebody who believes early, and you were one of those people for me, so a big thank you. A big thank you to Gina and Jerry Murdock for sponsoring this lecture. This is meant to be on well-being, generally understood as personal well-being. I think today we'll be talking about civic well-being and how that relates to personal well-being. And a final opening statement, which is that when you're a middle-class Midwesterner like me and you let slip that you're going to Aspen and speaking at the Aspen Institute, you get read a whole bunch of cautions like, everybody there is smarter than you. Everybody there is more important than you. Everybody there is more beautiful than you. And that list went on and on and on. And I was like, do my friends not like me? And no, they just have a high view of Aspen. So it's an honor to be here. I often feel like I shouldn't be here, but let's see how well we can do in this session, Elliot. The state of interfaith relations. Let's just talk about America for right now. I would say two words: scary and hopeful. Scary because of the obvious stuff, right? Dog whistles to anti-Semites is scary, right? Suggesting that Muslims ought to be barred from the United States is scary. So why do I also link that to hopefulness? It's because I think sometimes any group of people, when they have achieved something, and religious tolerance didn't fall from the sky for America. It is a deep and proud achievement. When they have achieved something, they think that it's inevitable, right? They think that it was always there and it will always be there. And the fact of anti-Semitism raising its ugly head, of Islamophobia becoming worse instead of better, just shows that religious pluralism or interfaith cooperation is something that you have to work on continually. And I'll just give you a quick example of this. So in the 1920s, if you were to stop the average educated citizen on the streets and said the words, "Aren't you proud to live in a Judeo-Christian society?" they would look at you as if you had 6 heads. That word didn't exist back then, right? Now we say it as if it's the first words you learn in English. We live in a Judeo-Christian society. But actually, the notion of a Judeo-Christian society emerges in 1927, 1928, after the ugly anti-Catholicism around Al Smith, a Catholic candidate for president, and a group of people start something called the NCCJ, the National Conference for Christians and Jews. And over the course of the next half century, they push very hard for this notion of a Judeo-Christian society. And over that 50 years, including major publications like Will Herberg's Protestant Catholic Jew, the election of John F. Kennedy, in the 1970s and 1980s, people begin naturally talking about a Judeo-Christian society. But it's an achievement. It didn't fall from the sky, right? And the expansion of religious pluralism and interfaith cooperation in the United States is something people are going to have to work at. And I think that for a while we got complacent, and we're not going to be complacent anymore.
Let's get back to, again, what Jerry and Gina are interested in terms of wellness. Just tell us what it would be like. And you spend a lot of time in college campuses or younger, for a young Muslim girl or woman in the United States who's afraid to wear a headscarf. Or the environment in campuses where people might be afraid to express sentiment favorable to Israel because of attacks that might be made on them. And obviously that has to have an enormous effect on one's psychological well-being, sense of identity, sense of pride in being American. In my mind, it's a violation of the American creed, right? I think about America as a place where 3 values are sacrosanct. Number 1, expression of identity, that you get to be who you are. You get to be Catholic or Muslim, you get to be gay or straight, you get to be who you are, right? And you have a right to express that identity. Number 2, America is a place where people with different identities have relationships with each other, even people who disagree on fundamental things. Gina and I were talking about this in the course of the video earlier. And number 3, America is something that's bigger than all of us, and a place that we all contribute to. Safe streets, good schools, clean air, constitutional rights. This is a part of our common good. And some political philosophers refer to this as approaching an overlapping consensus. When any of those things is violated, when people cannot express their identity, when there are divides such that people can't have relationships, when people think that the common good they either don't have a stake in or doesn't serve them, I just think that is a weakened nation. Well, let's actually pivot to the book. The interfaith leadership. Well, actually, even before that, why do you say interfaith and not interreligious or cross-religious? Why do you use the word faith and not religion?
So, my grad school geekiness is going to come out here a little bit. So if you break this into its component parts, inter means obviously the interaction of people with different identities, right? Which right now is like standard operating procedure in the United States. And faith we define coming out of the work of the scholar Wilford Cantwell Smith, which is your relationship with the tradition. So Islam is a tradition. It's 1,400 years old. It is prophets and poets who brought messages of monotheism and mercy. It is flowered everywhere from, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, et cetera, over the course of these centuries. An individual Muslim has faith because he or she has a relationship with that tradition, with particular rituals, with particular texts, with particular heroes. Now, of course, some things are more central than others, right? The Quran is the central book, but there's also other texts as well. Rumi's Mathnawi, for example, Fariduddin Attar's A Conference of the Birds. Individuals have faith insofar as they have a relationship with a tradition. So what do we mean by interfaith? We're asking the question, how are people's faiths affected by their interaction with people who are different? And how is our interactions with people who are different influenced by our faith or our relationship with our traditions?
I mean, one of the interesting things in your book, you seem to make an argument, and tell me if I'm wrong, that one actually becomes a better adherent of one's own faith by understanding other faiths.
Right. I think that there are two reasons for this. That's right. That's kind of a central theme of the book and my work at Interfaith Youth Core. I think there are two reasons for this. Number one, encountering somebody who does things differently than you do, has different doctrine, rituals, practice, etc., requires you to answer the question, why do I do things the way I do them, right? Which often makes you go back into your own tradition to either develop additional knowledge or at least gain articulacy in that knowledge. So if you were to ask my grandmother, who lived in largely a circle of people of her own faith community, Ismaili Muslims in India for much of the 20th century, and you were to say, why do you sing Ganans or why do you pray Thusby that way? She wouldn't have an answer for you, right? Because she hadn't encountered enough other people to develop answers out of that, right? In America right now, if you're Jewish, if you're evangelical, if you're Muslim, if you're Jain, particularly if you're a religious minority, you're encountering people from different backgrounds all the time. So somebody's saying to you, why are you a vegetarian? Why do you fast during Ramadan? What are those prayer beads? So you have to develop that knowledge and be able to articulate it. That's reason number one. Reason number two is, I'm convinced that deep in all of our religious traditions, there is a theology of interfaith cooperation, which is to say that holiness, that diversity is sacred. And I'll just tell you a brief story out of Islam on this. So in Surah 2 of the Holy Quran, we Muslims are taught that God creates us by picking up a lump of clay and giving it his breath, and thereby creates Adam, the first human being and our common ancestor. And he says to Adam, you are going to be my abd and Khalifa, my servant and representative upon the planet. Your role is to steward creation. And he says to the angels, I want you to come and honor Adam, the first human being whom I've given this task to. And the angels refuse to do it and say, why would we honor a creature who will only fiddle and destroy? And God responds, I know what you do not know. Okay, so God doesn't deny that humans are going to fiddle and destroy, which evidence is all around us, but he says that we're going to do other things as well. In effect, he vouches for our goodness in the face of the angels' denial. And then he sets up a contest between Adam and the angels. He says to the angels, I want you to tell me the names of creation. And the angels say, the only knowledge we have is to sing the glories of your name. And he turns to Adam, and he gives Adam the knowledge to tell God, to tell him back the names of creation. I remember being at Oxford reading this verse in the Quran and my kind of recommitment to Islam, and the term that struck me in that verse was the term names. It wasn't singular. It's not a single name repeated over and over, it was plural. God makes creation diverse, and the special quality he gives Adam is the ability to name and flow with that diversity. Diversity is sacred. The reason we are God's stewards on the planet is because we have the ability to steward diversity. It's holy. And Catholics and Jews and evangelicals and Buddhists and Jains all have stories along the same lines.
And also you point out in here, and it's worth reflecting, and you talk about your grandmother in India, that it's really a characteristic of modernity that people of religions really ever lived with each other.
Right. Again, to show graduate school geekiness. This is the core insight of a late 1970s book by a social theorist named Peter Berger. He says two words: modernity pluralizes. And he points out that for the vast majority of human history, the vast majority of human beings have lived amongst people very much like themselves. Same ethnic groups, same religion, etc. They didn't encounter people who were different. But modernity pluralizes. So now the vast majority of people on the planet, especially given communications technology, forget global cities and air travel, they come into contact with people who do things differently all the time. That is a massive change in the human condition, and it's basically taken place since after World War II. That shift in the majority of human beings interacting with diversity on a regular basis. It's a massive psychological change because, once a group of Muslims in a village who go to Friday Juma prayers and somebody moves in and doesn't go to Friday Juma prayers, well, there's a bunch of 18-year-olds in that village who are asking themselves the question, if she doesn't have to do it, why do I have to do it? Right? The self becomes a reflexive project. It's psychologically weighty. And the second question, of course, is, you're different than me. How do I relate to you? Right? You're not following the holy rites the way you ought to be following them. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, once asked the question, how do you live in peace with people you think are damned? Right? That's one of the essential questions of our era. And lots of people are saying they don't want to.
Exactly. So you've just published this book, and it conjures images perhaps of priests and rabbis and imams and their ceremonial clothes performing rituals, but that's not what you have in mind here. Just explain a little bit about what you mean by this.
So the United States is the most religiously diverse country in human history and the most religiously devout nation in the West. And what's important about religion in this country outside of the role it plays in people's individual lives is that it's the single most important source of social capital in America. Right? So, for example, just to use Catholics as an example, there are 2,800 four-year institutions of higher education in America. 230 of them are Catholic. Right? In Chicago, there are tens of thousands of students, half of whom who are not Catholic, who attend Catholic schools. Imagine if those schools just closed one day. What would happen to the public school system in Chicago? It would be overrun. What I'm saying is, our nation relies on the massive civic contributions of faith communities. And a major challenge for us going into the future is to make sure that we are able to bridge that social capital, to use a geeky term that Robert Putnam coined, which is to say the Jewish social capital, the Muslim, the Catholic social capital, the evangelical social capital, to build bridges between them such that you have this diverse array of social capital providing health, social, educational, well-being services to a nation, as opposed to having that social capital become bounded, look inward, become insular, turn into easy-to-form militias with their spears trained against one another. If you want to know what happened in Iraq between the beginning of the war and the emergence of ISIS, it is in no small part the social capital between Kurds, Sunnis, and Shias turning inward and effectively becoming some version of a militia, training its swords and spears on people elsewhere. That's not a happy future.
Let me ask a question. And it's similar, I don't want to be geeky, but it's the Prothero-Armstrong sort of debate, see where you come out. Are religions very different from each other?
Right.
Or are they very similar to each other?
Right. So Karen Armstrong, TED Prize winner, prolific comparative religions scholar and writer, she likes to say that religions in essence are the same and they focus on compassion and the rest is secondary, right? And Stephen Prothero is like, this is pretend pluralism, right? He's like, Jews don't go to pilgrimage in Mecca and Muslims don't practice communion. And you can't tell a Jew or a Muslim that these things aren't important. And I think in a way that they are both right, in the sense that there are certain values shared across religious traditions, which I think most members of those traditions would consider central. So, for example, mercy, hospitality, these are values shared across traditions. And there is a distinctive Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, and that's extremely important, right? And to say that that's, as Prather likes to say, that that's just the foothills of a religion and the summit is the shared values is unfair. So how do I respond to this in the book is very pragmatically, which is to say, I don't want to take a side in an intellectual debate because honestly, I'm not that smart. What I'd like to do is to ask the question, how do we encourage Jews and Muslims to live more constructively and cooperatively together in our society? And that's where interfaith leaders come in. Interfaith leaders have the ability to shape conversations around powerful commonalities in a tradition.
So give us some examples of good interfaith leadership. You also give some examples using yourself in the book of bad interfaith leadership. So give us some good examples and then tell us about some of the serious mistakes you made.
Right. I opened the book with the story of Ruth Messenger. Is that a familiar name to folks here? She was the president of the American Jewish World Service for many years, and before that, Manhattan Borough president in New York, a terrific person. And she's been a mentor of mine, an early supporter of IFYC as well. So I once asked her why she cared so much about interfaith cooperation, and she gave me this smile and said, "This is where I got my start." And it was the mid-1960s. Ruth, had grown up in a liberal Jewish house in New York City. She'd gone to Radcliffe. She'd gotten married, and she and her husband were peaceniks and feminists, and they were looking to escape the Vietnam War. And evidently, you could escape the war at that time if you were a doctor and were a doctor at a hospital, especially one in need. So they were hoping to get, placed in someplace like Chicago or New York, a major city, and if somehow they got placed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Ruth, or I think it was Tulsa, and then they moved around within Oklahoma. Ruth decides to make the most of a new experience. She gets her MSW from the University of Oklahoma, and this is the time of the Great Society, the Johnson administration, and there are national child welfare laws that are being passed. And so orphanage situations are changing rapidly across the country. And basically, you can't have some ramshackle orphanage that is like colluding with police who pick up runaways anymore. Ruth is the child welfare supervisor for the western half of Oklahoma. And her job is to find foster families for kids in this part of the state who are runaways, who are in really difficult positions. And so she's got a new baby, and she takes the baby carriage up and down streets in her little neighborhood, and she starts to notice these signs. Church of Jesus Christ who died for our sins, Church of our Holy Savior. And she thinks to herself, well, this is a place where people gather, and if it's a place where people gather, it's a place where a leader lives. So she knocks on the door of these little evangelical house churches. She introduces herself as the person who runs the new, state rep for child welfare in that part of the state, and she says, "Can I speak to your congregation?" And the pastor says, "Well, come back next Wednesday morning when we're having our praise service." So she comes back next Wednesday morning. She sits with 30 people in the backyard of this house. It's boiling hot outside. The pastor gives this fiery sermon, says a bunch of things that makes Ruth very uncomfortable as a liberal, feminist New York Jew, and then keeps his promise and says at the end, I've got somebody here who's going to talk about foster families. And Ruth gets up and gives her spiel about how hard up some juveniles are in that part of the state, and how they're moving away from orphanages, which often abuse the kids, and they're looking for foster families, etc. And the pastor gets up after Ruth speaks and says, "It is God's call that the members of this church stand up to serve in the way that Miss Messenger has invited us to." And Ruth was like astounded as 2/3 of the church would stand up and sign on the sheet to be foster families, right? And 30 years later, 40 years later, she's explaining this to me. She's like, I think about every area in which I disagreed with these people. They're all pro-Vietnam War. They're all looking at me askance because I'm working outside the home. if I had mentioned the word feminism to them, it would have been a big fight, right? They don't think that women should go to college. I disagree with them on everything. And if I had decided to turn around and walk out of that church because of those disagreements, there are hundreds of kids in Western Oklahoma who would have been abused in orphanages rather than had decent foster families. That's interfaith leadership.
And it's a wonderful way you start the book. Tell us, though, about what you call your own rookie mistakes. I think you talk in here about sometimes about the elephant in the room. And
Yes.
in many interfaith contexts, you don't want to talk about the elephant.
I call this another metaphor for this is the interfaith cage match, right? And people think to themselves, they think I want to get an audience for my interfaith event, so I'm going to choose the most contentious issue I can, abortion or same-sex marriage or where to draw the line in Israel or Palestinian territories or whether to draw the line at all. And I'm going to get the two most fiery people that I can find on the opposite ends of each of the extreme. I'm going to put them on a stage and I'm going to basically say, cage fight, right? And then people are surprised when people leave angry and hostile and say to themselves, I hate those people more than I did before I walked in, right? And people say to me all the time, but that's the important conversation to have. That's the elephant in the room. And my response is, there are other animals in the zoo, right? And if you only focus on the elephant in the room, if every time you bring Jews and Muslims together, it's about Israel and Palestine, you will never have the conversation about the beautiful similarities between Arabic and Hebrew. You will never have the conversation about the strong similarity on a very severe monotheism, an extremely focused monotheism, on the very interesting overlaps between halakha, Jewish law, and Sharia, Muslim law, right? And those are important conversations as well. This is not to say that abortion isn't important to talk about, but make the elephant one of the last animals you visit when you go to the zoo, right? Have the other conversations first. And a huge part about interfaith leadership is basically curating conversations. How do you invite people in? Which topics do you bring up? How do you facilitate?
Well, let's just talk about the people you invite in. I can imagine a very different kind of conversation if the people you invite in are, say, a Reform Jew who hardly ever goes to the synagogue, a Unitarian, a very progressive Muslim who doesn't fast during Ramadan and just culturally considers herself Muslim, as opposed to having a ultra-Orthodox Jew, a devout, committed evangelical Protestant, and a Wahhabi Muslim. I mean, it's got to be a very different conversation. I mean, it's easy in the former group to imagine a sort of kumbaya about mercy and grace and compassion for the weak and the suffering and the elderly. But what about the latter?
Right. So the thing that the people in the latter group will have in common, which might actually be the most salient thing, is their frustration with the people in the former group, right? And I'm actually very serious about that, right? So you can, but the larger point here, I think, is diversity is not just the differences you like. I am really tired of this elementary school idea of diversity. Diversity is our strength. Diversity, celebrate diversity. It's like diversity is all egg rolls and samosas, right? And it all tastes good. And, just depending, and if it doesn't taste good to you, it's because your palate is unsophisticated. Diversity is about how you live with people with whom you disagree on fundamental matters. And I think the best definition of what a religion is or what religiousness is are things about ultimate concerns, right? This is from Paul Tillich. So if you have a religiously diverse democracy, let's be geeky and define each of those terms. Democracy is not just a place where you vote for your elected representatives. Democracy is a place where you can make your private convictions public. Okay, diversity is not just the differences you like, it's also the differences you don't like, it's the disagreements. Religion is ultimate concerns, right? It's when does life begin? What is the purpose of life? Where do we go when we die? Who did God give this land to, right? we start to see why there's so many religious conflicts in the world. Because when you have disagreements about ultimate concerns and you live in societies where you are free to air your disagreements or advance your opinions or views, welcome to conflict, right? The question is, how do you have a healthy religiously diverse democracy? And I think the answer to that question is twofold. Number one, expect conflict. Do not expect to agree. Like if you it blows my mind the number of people, who will go to an interfaith event and come to me afterwards and be like, but they disagreed with me on God. I'm like, what did you think you were going to? Right? An interfaith event is not a place where people are going to agree with you. It is a place where people are going to disagree with you. The question is, what are you going to do with that disagreement? And I think a healthy, religiously diverse democracy is a place where people can disagree on some fundamental things and work together on other fundamental things.
Let's just talk about some of those fundamental things. Let's say that I am a devout Jehovah's Witness, and it is fundamental to me that I and my child go to heaven. And it's also fundamental to me that if my child gets a blood transfusion, he won't go to heaven. And my child has a terminal illness, has a serious illness, can be completely cured by a transfusion and will have a full and normal life. But if he doesn't have the transfusion, he will die. Right. So in an interfaith context, what do you say to me as a fellow citizen or a state?
So I have a two-part answer to that question, right? Number one, these are exactly the questions that I deal with in this book and that I find most interesting. I don't find the question of which clergy can you get together most interesting, because it only relates to 2% of the population. I find the questions of what do you do when people from a particular religious group, because of how they understand gender relations, request 2 hours of gender separate time at a public pool, right? Or what do you do when somebody in a medical environment says, my child is not having a seizure, my child is being prepared for shamanhood, as Hmong shamans might say, or in your example. So I guess I have two ways of thinking about this. Number one, I think the legal system has to, and the American legal system is actually extremely sophisticated about this because of the First Amendment, because we guarantee freedom of expression and religion, has to balance between reasonable accommodation and reasonable well-being rights. So I'm not a lawyer, maybe Meryl can answer this question, but I think that what the legal system has come down in the Jehovah's Witness question is, an adult Jehovah's Witness can make the adult decision that he or she will not have a blood transfusion and can effectively say, I recognize that I am going to meet death, but they cannot make that decision for their child. That in effect, the well-being value kicks in and overrides the religious accommodation value. But that's only one answer. Here's a second answer. And it comes out in a series of New Yorker articles that were published online, and I highly commend this to you. So a group of doctors in a New Jersey hospital basically asked what was a simple question, which is, if Jehovah's Witnesses had designed the US healthcare system, had designed the surgery procedures, they would have figured out a way to do surgery without blood transfusion. Very interesting, right? In effect, because the surgery system was designed by people who were not Jehovah's Witnesses and for whom blood transfusions isn't a problem at all, all surgeries are done with blood transfusions. So they gave themselves the medical thought experiment, how would we do surgeries without blood transfusions? And they offered these parallels to themselves. There are many people who are vegetarian as a result of religious commitments. Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists. That's a large percentage of the world, right? What if your nutritionist said, sorry, you're just gonna be protein deficient for the rest of your life because the only way I do nutrition is to do protein is to do it around meat. Now, it's easier to work nuts into a diet than it is to change surgery procedures, but billions of citizens in India have lived healthy lives for millennia figuring out other ways to get protein, right? It's a very interesting question to ask. When met with a situation in which one thinks to oneself, this is crazy that, Orthodox believers, and in this case it could be Orthodox Jews or Orthodox Muslims, will not swim with people from a different gender. It's because people with a different identity design the society. Now, those people have every right to be who they are, but the Orthodox Jews do also. So how do you balance the religious accommodation, constitutional and legal value, right, with the well-being and other kind of broader community values at stake? And the answer is, I find these fascinating questions because they bring up this set of principles and precisely the kinds of things that are, and I think ought to be talked about at a place like the Aspen Institute. One more thing here. What happens when your demographic changes, right? So in other words, I'm at a college in Pennsylvania. Its name is escaping me right now, but a historically Lutheran college, right, that in the last 40 years has drawn a significant Jewish population. So 40 years ago, there's pork everywhere, right? The term kosher might never have been heard about except for maybe a comparative religion scholar. Now that college has 2 kosher kitchens. The population changes. You respectfully accommodate that new population. Do you do it in a manner that curtails other people's identities? I think that's when it gets interesting. What happens when the Harvard swimming pool has women-only hours for 4 hours on Sunday because Muslim women have requested it? In this case, you are restricting other people's expression or rights. Men can't swim in the pool in those hours, right? That's when it gets interesting, and I think those are exactly the kinds of questions we ought to be asking as a diverse society.
Well, I'm going to let the audience ask questions in a minute. I just want to ask one more thing. What role should schools play in these issues, if any, and particularly given the Establishment Clause and what schools can do about religion? Schools can certainly talk about religion, they can't promote religion, but can schools play a role to improve well-being of children on this subject of religious tolerance?
So I'll try to be as brief as possible with a 2-part answer. So in Interfaith, in my book, I talk about the emergence of an academic field called interfaith studies, right? Just like you have the emergence of environmental studies and public health, and part of the purpose of these fields is to create environmentalists, create public health experts. If we are going to build interfaith bridges in our society, I think we're going to need a critical mass of interfaith leaders, and for that to happen, they need to be able to participate in research, in inquiry, in practice, et cetera. I think that best takes place on college campuses. And there are now maybe 20 interfaith studies minors across the country. So I think campuses have a significant role to play. And campuses don't have the same, especially private campuses, don't have the same church-state kind of restrictions that public schools, K through 12, ought to. Or do. So interestingly on this, there's a Supreme Court case in the 1960s which says, Abington versus Shemp, I think is the case, which says teaching religion cannot happen in our public schools. You can't do catechism. You can't do, Sunday school. But teaching about religion is not only legal, it's encouraged, right? And this is in the 1960s, 50 years ago, when we were largely a Jewish, Catholic, Protestant society, without the significant numbers of Muslims, Jains, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Baha'is that we have now. Which is to say that the K through 12 school system, by Supreme Court statement, is allowed to do a lot more than they think they can. When I hear a school superintendent say, oh, we're not allowed to do that because of the Constitution, my response is, you're using that as cover for not wanting to delve into complex and contentious territory, which I understand, but the problem is when responsible and good people don't engage religious diversity, you just forfeit the territory to less responsible and less good people.
My last question, in your book, you actually make many references to the importance of humanists as part of this conversation. It's not just Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Hindus. It's people without religion. And I wonder, when you look at some of the interreligious problems, for example, in Europe today, and many people think America is migrating this way, in some countries, the vast majority of people claim they have no religion. And some are suggesting that some of the anti-Muslim prejudice, for example, in France, is less that it's anti-Muslim than it's anti-religious, because the rest of people never go to church. They don't think of themselves as religious. So how does that particular conflict between people without faith and people with faith factor into these issues?
So at IFYC, humanists have a seat at the table like anybody else. We view humanism as a tradition. It has important texts like the Humanist Manifesto. It has important heroes like Albert Einstein, the posters up in Walter's office, like A. Philip Randolph, et cetera, et cetera. So we understand it as a tradition, and we invite the very significant number of college students who come to our programs who say they're not religious. We say, we invite you to define yourself as something affirmative rather as not something else. And so we invite you to consider if you view yourself as a humanist as opposed to just somebody who doesn't have a box to check. So this is all to say that, we are not interested in a circle of believers versus non-believers, right? We're interested in nurturing a healthy, religiously diverse democracy, and what that means is you deal with the identities of the people who are within the borders that you're working in.
Wonderful. I'm going to open it because we're broadcasting. We're taping this for the website. We need to wait for microphones. So right here, and if I can have the people with the mics help me find hands because it's hard, but I see there's someone here too. But do please, both of you, make sure you move around the room. And if you could just give us your name and the question. Thank you.
I'm Charlotte Beers, and I have been asked to talk about mounting a campaign against ISIS because I come out of the communication business. And ISIS has done a brilliant social media job of doing their own proselytizing. But how do you feel about that as a concept in the way we defend our people in our country? And the same thing is an issue in other countries.
I mean, first of all, I think it's super important, right? Secondly, I think it's very interesting to watch how ISIS actually does its work, and it's not mass communications. The thing that differentiates ISIS from Al-Qaeda or previous era terrorist groups is they will text you back. They will tweet you back. They will find the 15-year-old lonely kid, and a kid can be from any background, right? The crazy thing is the number of people who are not devout Muslims who go, whose basic characteristic is adolescent dislocation, and they will tweet you back. And I don't know how any mass, at this point, nobody, I mean, literally, after bombings from Brussels to Paris to Medina, I mean, for a Muslim, are you kidding me? Like, there are prophetic sayings about the safety and holiness of Medina, right? The mass campaign has billions and billions of people. What ISIS is playing on is one-on-one, under the radar contact, and they have like tens of thousands of people tweeting kids back. I just don't know. I don't know how responsible forces deal with that. I wish I did.
I heard what you said today about Jewish and Muslim cooperation and living together. But I have heard so much about the unrest on the college campuses by Muslims and Palestinians who may or may not be Muslims against Israel and Jews. Would you comment on how that could be combated?
Sure. So, interestingly, IFYC, the organization that I run, and me personally, we're we have worked with a set of those campuses, including after the incidents happen. And, I am clear and we are clear that people have a right to be who they are, right? You have a right to be Jewish. You have a right to be Jain. You have a right to be pro-Israel. You have a right to question Israel. People get to be who they are, and they ought to be able to be that in a manner that is not that is not dramatically repressed, which is to say, you can disagree with somebody. What you can't do is hound or harass them out of the circle. I also want to say that, so my organization did a number of visits to UCLA after the Rachel Beta incident 2 years ago, which was a front page Sunday New York Times story, and it was a travesty, right? That this highly qualified young woman was asked, I think, extremely out of line questions about her Jewish identity as she was applying to a judicial board. And so we go to UCLA several times after that. We articulate our set of principles, which is people have a right to their identities. There ought to be relationships between people from different backgrounds, and there ought to be commitment to the common good. It is interesting to point out that in the next iteration of the Muslim and Jewish groups on campus, the heads of those associations met in the course of the workshops that we ran, right? Which is precisely why we run these workshops, to create private, Aspen, like the food's not as good, but private spaces in which people who might be at odds on significant issues can meet and develop relationships and a positive rapport, right? So that's hugely important. I think many, many more campuses are doing that right now. And the Muslim girl who was the head of the Muslim Students Association said to my colleague, I can show you the stack of hate mail that I got about being Muslim, but nobody did a story on that. This is only to say that whatever is happening, as Susan Sontag said in her Jerusalem Prize address, there is always something else going on, right? So whatever anti-Semitism is happening on campuses, it is hugely ugly. It ought to be called out. And there are other things going on as well. Whatever Islamophobia is happening in this country, and it is hugely ugly and it ought to be called out and stamped out, there are other things going on as well, right? And I find that, I find that striking that Susan Sontag says that, and I think it's like a deep piece of wisdom. It is a catch against availability bias, which is to say that when I read a story about a 13-year-old Muslim girl wearing a hijab who gets harassed in junior high, do I immediately think every 13-year-old girl across the country who wears hijab is getting harassed? Or do I view that as a single story amidst a multitude of diverse stories? I think it's useful to simply recognize there's lots of things going on all the time. The anti-Semitism on campuses ought to be called out. It ought to be called out proactively. It's increasingly being called out proactively, and it is one of a multitude of challenges.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. I'm Sheldon Lubar from Wisconsin. I believe you visited the Lubar Institute for the study of Abrahamic religion.
Yes.
I'm sorry I wasn't there. This was part of the School of Liberal Arts. They weren't teaching anything, and my wife and I endowed this and submitted the suggestion to the university that they establish an institute for the study of Abrahamic religions on the theory that the three major religions in the world all trace their roots to Abraham. And I thought, this was after 9/11, that I thought if we could get an educational institution, like a public institution like the University of Wisconsin, to take this on and bring in persons like yourself. And the first speaker there was the Grand Mufti of Bosnia. I mean, we got a lot of high-level people there. We all agree on the 10 Commandments. That was the first seminar they had. And yet, in my eyes, it has not taken root. I would say typically there are in the class 20, well, maybe 30 people, no, maybe 25, of which 16 or 17 are Muslims. It was most attractive to Muslims. And it's been a real disappointment, and I'm wondering, you were there, if you have any comment.
Sure. So I'm going to start with an analogy. People always ask why the first Velvet Underground album, it's a rock and roll analogy. People always ask why the first Velvet Underground album was so influential when it only sold a few thousand copies. And the answer is because everybody who bought the album went out and started a band. Right? And I actually think that that's how the Academy works. I think that's how the Aspen Institute works. The influence of this isn't that there are 20,000 people in the audience, right? It's the 100 of you who are in the audience, right? The influence of an academic institute isn't, I don't think, the hundreds of people necessarily in public lectures. It's the 40 people a year who make a decision. I am going to be an interfaith leader for the rest of my life as a result of this. And when I lead in the AJC chapter in Washington, D.C., or when I lead, when I become the imam of a mosque in Southern California, I'm going to bring the lessons of what I learned here, the knowledge and the skills, into that space. My own sense is anytime one is doing something in the academy, one has a 25-year horizon at the very least. Now, that doesn't mean one doesn't check, every year to make sure that things are reasonably on track. But the reason we work at within higher education at IFYC, I've got two board members here, Dick and Sylvia Kaufman, who will happily sing from this hymn book as well, is because we want to make the kind of difference that has a lasting impact on our society, right? And I actually thought the Lubar Institute was a pillar of that. And there were people at public universities across the country who were saying, could we do something like this? Now, universities, the only thing that moves slower than a university is a glacier, right? So the conversation that the University of Texas might have been having in 2008 might not have even turned into a recommendation and a strategic plan until 2018. But the thing about investing in the academy is you wake up 30 years later and you think to yourself, wow, hospice care is now ubiquitous. And it starts with an investment at Yale University 50 or 60 years ago in senior medicine. Right? Wow, environmentalism is now ubiquitous. Well, it starts with particular investments in universities 50 or 60 years ago. It's not the only way to do things, right? But universities uniquely combine research, teaching, and a bunch of young people asking how they ought to spend the next 60 years of their lives.
Well, we thank you very much. Jerry?
So what do you think about the role of the media, particularly broadcast media, in exacerbating sort of problems of intolerance? And if you think there's an issue there, what would you like to see happen, or what would you like to recommend we do about that?
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a really important question. So, if the only thing you knew about Chicago was the first 2 minutes of the local news broadcast every night for a year, seriously, would you ever, what would you think of that city? Right? A bunch of rapists and murderers. Right? So why do so many people say, I love Chicago? Because their range of knowledge is much broader than that. My concern about the broadcast media and religion right now, with particular attention to Islam and religious conflict, is that what many, many people know about Islam is the first 2 minutes of the news. This is not to say that the Muslim world is not in a crisis. It is in an absolute crisis, and we Muslims have to get, this whole thing of but don't tell other people our problems. I'm like, do you think they don't know? right? I mean, there are multiple crises in the Muslim world. There's a crisis of extremism, there's a crisis of a Sunni-Shia civil war, there's a crisis of state repression. And there are 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. And it's a 1,400-year-old tradition. And just like Chicago is not just its gang problem, Islam is not just its extremism problem. And one of the things that frustrates me about the broadcast news is, I mean, think of it this way. If you're a toothpaste company, you know, one of the great marketing geniuses is in the room. If you're a toothpaste company and you want to advertise on the broadcast news, you have to pay $50,000 or whatever for 30 seconds. But if you're a Muslim extremist, all you got to do is behead somebody, videotape the beheading, and send it to the broad, and they'll advertise for free. Seriously. I mean, why do you think these people take the pain to videotape their beheadings? They're not doing it for an archive for 100 years from now. They're doing it because they want to create a certain image about Islam and the rest of the world. And what does broadcast news do? They basically collude. Now, I think broadcast news is in a very different position. Do you not report that? Is it not news? I mean, I think it's news. At the same time, you're being played. You know, they know exactly what you're going to do.
Actually, if it's one quick question, because we do try to end these on time, but please, and when we'll have one quick answer, right, Eboo?
As quick as I can.
There's a book that Harvey Cox wrote about the future of faith, and he posed that the people that will communicate cross-faith are more similar than the people within those faiths, and that he felt that it was more important that communications exist between, say, the Bible literalist Christian and the progressive Christian, or ISIS and a mystic Rumi Muslim. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
So, I mean, I honestly think it's all important, and I mean, part of the reason I wrote this book was to suggest that the vision, knowledge, and skills required for a Sufi Salafi dialogue within Islam and for a Jewish Muslim dialogue are actually quite similar, right? That there is a clear vision, there's a codified knowledge, and there's a specific set of skills you need to be able to do that well. I call that interfaith leadership. And just like social entrepreneur has become an identity category in the culture, and you now hear 14-year-olds say, you know, I want to be a social entrepreneur. Our hope at Interfaith Youth Core, and my hope with this book, is that you have lots and lots of kids on college campuses saying, I see a problem within my religion and between my religion and others, and I want to be the kind of person who bridges that divide, and that is called an interfaith leader.
Well, Eboo, we all wish you great success in your very important work.